I'd like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Henry Wickes. He's an adjunct professor in philosophy at the University of St. Thomas. He lives in Maple Plain with his wife and son, and he is currently working on completing his doctorate in theology from the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies in Marriage and Family in Washington, D.C. His dissertation is on the theology of property ownership and critiquing an extreme form of poverty proposed by a controversial group of medieval Franciscan monks. His talk tonight will be on the meaning of work as seen through the hands of St. Joseph. And here's Dr. Henry Wickes.
Just a minor correction. I'm not a doctor yet, but hopefully soon. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. So, in the heat of the day, I might ask myself, what is it all for? Why am I doing this work? Perhaps I tell myself with reassurance that I work to put food on the table, that the money I bring in is enough to feed my family, to clothe and house myself and my family, and I cannot ask for any more than that. Or perhaps I remind myself that idle hands are the devil's workshop, and rejoice that my hands are set to the weary task so that I may work for hard work's sake. Yet still I may bristle at my possessions and my job and wonder, perhaps I should give everything away and devote myself to a more meaningful calling. Perhaps start a ministry or work for the church. Now, of course, none of these sentiments are wholly wrong, right? But in these and similar thoughts, we may succumb to a temptation to isolate our work or work itself from its genuine human meaning. Assessing the meaning of our work is a difficult task because we have a tendency to view it extrinsically. Far too often, the primary question that we ask ourselves is, how can this work make money? And yet, monetary value itself tells us nothing, as it's only ever an imperfect reflection of real value. The inverse tendency to view work primarily through the lens of how much labor it takes or how much labor it saves is also just as extrinsic, just as problematic. In fact, just as problematic is what Max Weber termed the Protestant work ethic, which, even though we're Catholics, I think can very easily slip into our minds, which is this idea that my hard work, my discipline, or my frugality in this life can somehow invite God's approval, and that will be evidenced by the fruits that I receive through my diligence. But of course, as we know, right, genuine good work sometimes goes unnoticed or unrecognized or unfulfilled. More subtle but still problematic is the pervasive idea that work only has value if we enjoy what we are doing, or if the work immediately serves something that we see as a grand purpose or profound need. Of course, all of these perspectives fail to ask some fairly important questions. Where does our work come from? What actually is work? And what is this work that I am doing? And most importantly, what is this work for? These questions feel subjective because we have habituated ourselves to avoiding them. We easily forget that work is not a consequence of the fall of Adam. And that we forget that it's not that we must now endure or find ways to sanctify work. Rather, as John Paul II wrote in his encyclical letter, Laborem Exercens, from the beginning, man is called to work. Work is one of the characteristics that distinguish man from the rest of creatures. End quote. In the Garden of Eden, man was called to work, and although our work now entails toil, sweat, and hardship, nevertheless, that unique dignity of work remains. Do that next slide. Reflecting on the life of St. Joseph, we can see a steadfast example of what it looks like to ask the right questions about the intrinsic nature and value of our work. His example can completely transform the way that we approach our work and help us to discover the meaning of the gifts that we have received through the tasks that are set before us. So to help us better understand Joseph's comportment towards work, tonight I want us to consider the hands of St. Joseph, specifically in common artistic depictions. And in art, we typically see Joseph's hands depicted in one of three ways. There are others, but these are the most common. The first is holding the Christ child. Very, very familiar images, right? This image, you may have seen similar images on prayer cards or in paintings. Christ is often depicted holding the Christ child, but just as often he's depicted holding lily flowers, which are the traditional symbol of purity. But we also see Joseph often represented holding carpenter's tools, specifically, typically the carpenter's square is called. Now, each of these symbols can tell us something about the intrinsic meaning of work through the purpose of our hands. Sometimes we even see all three symbols used because each of these symbols helps us to understand a different aspect of Joseph's task on earth. So we see in this icon over here, we see all three symbols all at once. Joseph holding Christ, holding the carpenter's tools, and holding the lily flowers. So first, in holding Christ, we see that our hands are made to receive reality in its intrinsic goodness. And that intrinsic goodness is given to us by the creative activity of God. So in our hands, in looking at Joseph's hands and what he's doing, we recognize God's action in our lives. Second, in holding the tools of the carpenter trade that he had, we see that our hands are made for us to respond to and actively participate in God's creative activity. And third, in the lilies, we see that our hands are made to bear true and pure fruit through our work for the common good. So let us begin with the images of Christ, or of Joseph holding the Christ child. So could we do the next slide, please? It has often been said that Joseph does not speak at all in the Gospels. But this is not entirely true. While we don't have any direct quotations from Joseph, the Gospel of Matthew tells us one very important moment in which Joseph speaks. Joseph gives Jesus his name. This is in Matthew 1, chapter 1, verse 25. It says, "And he called his name Jesus." Now we ought to take a moment to consider the magnitude of this act. It was of vital importance for Jewish culture that the father name the child, and in so doing, the father would give the child their mission. Now Joseph, in naming Jesus, thus gives him his mission to become the Savior of the world. Note here that in sacred art, where Joseph is holding Jesus, it's not uncommon to see him holding the entire world in his hands. I couldn't find any good images for tonight. A lot of them are actually sculptures or statues, but it's very common to see Joseph holding the world in his hands. Well, the reason why is because the name Jesus refers him to his mission to save the world. And so Joseph gave Jesus his name, but we need to remember that it was not Joseph who was responsible for the creation of Jesus' human nature. Nor was he responsible for his birth. He was his adoptive father. But nor did he even choose the name that was given to Jesus. It is not primarily Joseph's choice, which is remarkable here, but rather his receptivity. Joseph receives Mary as his spouse, and he receives Jesus as his adopted son. And he receives the name that he gives to Jesus from an angel of God. So we measure Joseph's faithfulness to God, first and foremost, not by what he does, but by his receptivity to what God does. In acting this way, Joseph is mirroring his ancestor Adam, the representative of all humanity. Indeed, the Bible goes to extreme lengths to show that Joseph is a direct descendant of Adam. Adam's creation and the creation of the entire world is accomplished entirely without Adam's action, choice, consent, and yet, from the very beginning, even before the fall, Adam was tasked with exercising dominion over the earth. In his first exercise of that dominion, God brings before him all the manifold creatures which God himself has created and tasks Adam with giving them names. This act of naming is the first human act of work, wherein Adam responds to and receives all that God has made. And along with God, he recognizes that it is good. Even after the fall, when our work is wearisome, we nevertheless can and must recognize that what God has made is good. What both Adam and Joseph understood is that any work that they might do always comes after the work that God himself has done in creation. Their calling to work begins not with their own actions, but rather with the readiness to receive what God has done for them. This means that we cannot undertake faithful or fruitful work if we do not first recognize that from the beginning, God is responsible for every moment of our work. He has given us our gifts, our talents, our skills, as well as the material and the earthly means by which we might exercise those gifts. To understand my own work better, then, I must freely and wholly receive that which God has given and call it good. This task requires that we contemplate what is before us, so that we might come to know reality as it really is. Our gifts and talents, then, are not first and foremost tools to be leveraged for further ends, or capital to be used by ourselves or by someone else to use us for our gifts so that we can produce. While production is certainly a good thing, that is not the primary purpose of our gifts. Rather, our gifts are real goods in and of themselves, by which we are brought into God's own creative work. Similarly, the material things whereby we act, or upon which we act, are not mere means to whatever ends that we seek. Rather, they are intrinsic goods, which we receive and must respond to for our work to fully bear fruit. Consider a manufacturer, right? This is I think, a helpful image. Consider a manufacturer who creates a table out of particle board. Now, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with particle boards or tables that are made out of particle boards. And in all likelihood, the manufacturer is still intending to make something good. But consider the way that that manufacturer will look at the trees that they are using. In all likelihood, they'll look at them merely as a source of sawdust, merely as a means to whatever ends that particle board can be reworked into. Now, to understand what we mean by the intrinsic meaning of work, let's instead consider a carpenter who sees a majestic tree and sincerely tries to respond to the goodness that he finds in that tree. That receptivity will mark everything that the carpenter does, from the tree that he selects for work, which tree he decides to cut down and use, the way that he cuts it down, how he treats the tree while it's still alive, how the tree is cut up, and how it is worked into a beautiful table upon which he will feast with his family. In this case, the more that he knows about trees, and especially the more he knows about this particular tree, the better his work will be. The more receptive he is to the goodness of the tree, the more his work will flourish. Can we do the next slide, please? The second symbol that we want to consider is Joseph holding the carpenter's tools. Now, we know very little about what has been called the hidden life of Jesus, which are those 30 years that he lived in the intimacy of the Holy Family. And yet, the hiddenness of those years is itself remarkable. As Christ became flesh, not in a palace of a king, but in the everyday house of a humble carpenter. The vast majority of Christ's life was not spent preaching or healing, but learning the trade of carpentry as an apprentice to his father. The poet Charles Peguy points to this everyday life of Jesus as a reflection of the eternal destination of man. In his Portal to the Mystery of Hope, he says, "When Jesus worked at his Father's shop, every day he relived the same. There was never any trouble, except once. And yet this is the fabric within those days of sameness. This is the web of the same workdays that eternally make up the admirable life of Jesus before his preaching, his private life, his perfect life, his model life, the life that he offers as an example, as an inimitable model to imitate." It was Jesus' hidden life, learning carpentry, which prepared him to enter his public ministry and his public life. As a side note, the word that Scripture uses for Joseph's trade is tekton, which can refer to any craftsman. So some, whether or not they work with wood or with stone, and since wood was hard to come by in ancient Israel, some have speculated that perhaps Joseph and Jesus were actually stonemasons. However, I do think it's worth noting, St. Justin Martyr, in the century after Jesus, so it's not too long after Jesus, says that Jesus worked as a carpenter making plows and yokes. And I think this would explain the frequent yoke and also beam imagery, plow and yoke and beam imagery that Christ uses in the Gospels. Sorry, it's a side note. So Joseph's use of the carpenter's tools was not merely his livelihood. It was not only the means whereby he supported the needs of Mary and Jesus. Rather, it was his unique task to be a carpenter and to teach Jesus carpentry. This work was not accidental to his role in salvation history. The repeated everyday work was part of his mission. Those hands which held the carpenter's square are the very same hands which held the child Jesus in the manger. Now, as John Paul II emphasized in Laborem Exercens, the measure of work is the person, not the other way around. Work is not the measure of the person is the measure of work. It is always a human person who does work, and thereby brings to bear every facet of their personhood, their body and their soul, to bear on their work. So to say that the person is the measure of work does not mean that we measure work by what it can provide people. When we value our work primarily for what it can do, we actually lose the personal dimension of work. If we focus on the money it can make, or even the goods it can provide the world, then we aren't looking at the actual act of working. We aren't asking the question, what does it mean for me to work? In fact, if we only look at what we are producing, then we will inevitably stop asking about how we are producing it. Rather quickly, the person working gets reduced to a means to produce whatever that is. Sometimes we do this even to ourselves through a mindset inspired by the aforementioned Protestant work ethic, right? When we reduce the work itself to what we do, as though it is the productivity itself that is the virtue, well, then we lose sight of the intrinsic personal dimension of work. While our work does provide real goods, such as wages, profits, and products, right, these are secondary implications. They are subordinate to the intrinsic good of the work itself that I do and that we all do. So Joseph's hands teach us that the value of work is the work itself, because it has a particular dignity. The value is not what the work produces, but it is the human person giving themselves to their work, and thereby participating in God's divine work. Everything that the person does is capable of being a real human participation in God's divine work. Thus, one of the principal gifts that God gives to man is work itself. And so the receptivity, about which we talked on the previous slide, the receptivity to God's good gifts which is symbolized by Joseph holding the child Jesus, is not the end of the picture. But rather, we must receive so that we can become real participants in God's shaping of the world. This is why John Paul II can say that our work enters into our salvation, which is a very striking claim. This means that it's through work, which is man's special dignity, that we can grow closer to God and indeed become more like God. To say that man's work has a special dignity means that his participation in the divine work of God is exercised in every task that man does, from the most profound contemplation to the most menial labor. The whole of man is involved in his work, from his intellect down to his hands. In fact, St. Thomas Aquinas gives us a special honor to the hands alongside human reason as instruments of our dignity. Our intellectual capacities as human beings, he says, can extend to the infinite because we can know all things, all universals, all ideas. And so, since our intellect stands ready to receive knowledge about the things we encounter in the world, likewise, our hands mirror this openness to the infinite. Our hands, therefore, are more fitting than if we had claws or horns or sharp teeth, which would allow us to be better at some things, but not able to open to the infinite in the way that our hands are. In fact, this is why the philosopher Aristotle called the hands, he called them the organs of organs, right? The most central human organs to being human. Because through them we exercise this special creative power, which we alone of all earthly creatures possess. Nevertheless, we do not subjugate the world, we do not dominate, control, manifest our own power in the world for our own whims or purposes. This special dignity of work is not found in our capacity to make things as we want them to be. Indeed, this dignity can never be separated from having received creation. When we work to try and further our own ends apart from God, we inevitably diminish our own gifts rather than upholding them. Rather, our dignity comes from God's generous gift to include us in his plan for the world. It is through work that we, as John Paul II says, relate ourselves to the totality of things relate ourselves and the totality of things to him who was to be acknowledged as the Lord and Creator of all. So I'm going to say that again because I think that's really profound. It is through work that we relate ourselves and the totality of things, all of creation. We relate those things and ourselves to him, to Christ, who was acknowledged as the Lord and Creator of all. So I want to take this moment to speak a little bit to my own work as an academic, because I face this reality every single time I sit down to write, for this paper included. And I frequently wonder whether I am really doing something that's worthwhile. I mean, oftentimes I'm merely citing other people, usually, I would say almost exclusively, more intelligent people than myself, right? And what good can my words have if someone could simply find these ideas spoken in a more eloquent way elsewhere? Over time, I've come to realize, however, that the value that my work has is not in its uniqueness or its profoundness or its marketability, but rather in my own real participation in God's work. God doesn't need me to come up with bold new ideas. You know what we call bold new ideas in the realm of theology? Heresies. Rather, what God wants from me is nothing more than me. Right? He wants my participation in his work, in creating and saving the world. And yes, participation in saving the world. Right? We can say that as Catholics because we recognize that participation doesn't mean that we become the head or the main actor, but we are being brought into God's work in creating and saving the world. We see the importance of this participation perfectly in the aforementioned act we talked about of Joseph naming Jesus. Jesus didn't come up with the name Jesus. Joseph didn't come up with the name Jesus, right? But his participation in naming Jesus was indispensable to God's work. God willed not only that his son would be named Jesus, but that the name would come through the work of his adopted father, Joseph. God chose Joseph for this task, and likewise, he has chosen all of us to humbly take up the tasks before us, even if they are less obviously important than the naming of the Messiah. All right, can we do the next slide, please? Lastly, I want us to consider the symbol of the lilies. Now, the lilies are classically a symbol of purity, which represents Joseph's perfect chastity. This virtue was essential for the spouse of the Blessed Virgin Mary, of course, because she had vowed to serve God as a perpetual virgin. It was Joseph's purity which gave him the strength to focus only on the true goods of Mary and his relationship with her, and to not reduce their married life to a relationship of use. Of course, obviously, it's possible to have chastity apart from a abstaining relationship. But for in that particular case, because of Mary's vow of perpetual virginity, this was the only way. And so that virtue of purity was essential for his relationship to Mary. But it also can provide us an image of how we are to exercise our hands in day-to-day work. Now, the lily is an image of purity precisely because of its white color, which you can see in the examples up here, and its absence of markings, and its delicate nature. In fact, in the New Testament, Jesus uses the lilies of the field to represent perfect trust and receptivity to God. He says in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, "Why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field and how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, and yet, I tell you, even Solomon in all of his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is today alive and tomorrow thrown into the oven, how much more will he not clothe you, O men of little faith?" So we see that purity requires total trust in God. The antithesis of purity is grasping at goods, even genuine goods, rather than trusting in God to provide genuine beauty and goodness to us. This purity and trust in God is exemplified in the vision of work which we have laid out here thus far. Impure working would grasp at productivity or try to imagine that it is the work of the individual which generates value. It would create a false idol of productivity, which imagines that it is up to the workers to generate real value. Such an extrinsic measure of value muddies the purity of work and its value, and it may even exclude authentically good work on the basis of productivity or profits or maintaining a bottom line. And the question we need to ask then is, how does Joseph work? Well, the worker who, like Joseph, has a pure heart, places his trust in God. He knows that it is enough to receive the good gifts that God gives, as Joseph receives Christ, and to wholeheartedly give his whole work, or his whole person into his work, as Joseph did in his work of carpentry. Now, it is from these two dimensions that a third gift is given. So we have the gift of God himself, and God creating and giving us both the things of the earth and our own gifts. Then we have the gift of work, wherein we take that on and we participate in God's act of creation. And from those two, acting together, we get a third gift, which is the genuine fruit of one's labor. Note, we say fruit and not productivity or not product. Product refers to something extrinsic, something not already implied in the work. But if we see that work is a response to God, we recognize that work already has built into it what will be created, what will come from it, a fruit. This fruit is somehow neither of the two constitutive components, while simultaneously displaying and manifesting the goodness of both. The primary result of our work then is more than just what we have received from God. So, and it's also more than the work we put into it. So let's consider that example of the carpenter again. The carpenter who makes the beautiful dining room table. Now, that carpenter is bringing together his own activity with the goodness of creation. We have two dimensions working in tandem. And from those two together, something wholly new is made that is more than what preceded it. As the philosopher D.C. Schindler says, this is a new reality that bears the traces, as it were, of its two sources. The work which brings about this new union bears witness. This is a striking quote. He says it bears witness to the surprising goodness of self-sacrificing love, which is the love of God himself. I'm going to say that again, right? The work which we do, which creates something new, that creation, that fruit, right, bears witness to the self-sacrificing goodness, the surprising goodness of self-sacrificing love, which is the love of God himself. So the table itself bears the marks of care and love and work which the carpenter poured into it, while at the same time retaining its history and bare reality of a tree as a tree from which it came. And yet this new reality, this table, becomes something new for an even greater good, the place where the sacred activity of family meals can unfold. This fruit comes not from the hard work of the carpenter alone, nor from God and his gifts in creation alone, but from the union of the two. No one looking at this tree on its own would predict this beautiful fruit, and yet the tree remains the necessary and ever-present reality behind the table. The particular tree will, as long as the table remains, be a part of that household. And at the same time, it was the carpenter's skill and diligent work which brought this capacity out of the tree. And so, together, they produced a third good, which itself, this table, is a genuine good for man. So thus we see, in the hands of St. Joseph, a clear example to follow in order to discover the goodness of our own work, and in order to strive to create real goods and real value with our time and talents. So first, we must first and foremost have a total receptivity to the gifts which God offers us. We see this in the hands of Joseph holding the Christ child. Now, that means a couple things. First, we have to ask, what are these gifts that we have received? What are they? What is the tree that's before me? What is this talent I have to shape this tree? What is the internal logic of this gift, both the thing in the world and my own talent? Or in fact, those with whom I work, right? My coworkers and those around me. And then I must ask, what do I have? What can be done with it? Not as some abstract exercise in how I can exercise my power over nature, but rather, what do my capacities reveal about the gift? What am I able to do to be fruitful with this gift? And as long as we have the fruit in mind, it's pure fruit in mind as we're going forward, it will help us to understand the gift itself. So I can ask myself, am I using and responding to these God-given gifts in a way that does justice to why they were given? Now, as we said, this doesn't need to be an exercise in scrupulosity to ask, am I doing enough? Am I doing enough? The question isn't, am I doing enough? The question is, am I using it faithfully? Second, we must really appropriate those gifts that we have been given and actively participate in God's act of creation, which we saw in the hands of Joseph holding the carpenter's tools. It is in so doing that we become like God. Because only God is the ultimate creator, and yet he wants us to co-create with him. This is the profound, and sometimes it sounds a little bit scandalous, but it's true, message of the Christian faith, is that God wants us to be like him. This tells us then that how and why and for what we do our work is not irrelevant. This doesn't mean that we must work for the church or run a nonprofit or do some sort of profound work in order to have our work have meaning. But it does mean we need to be asking, are we using our gifts in a way that genuinely cooperates with God's creative power? And third, we must entrust ourselves and our work ultimately to God's will, and not seek to insert ourselves or our own ends and desires. This doesn't mean that we ignore our ends and desires. This doesn't mean that we can't seek things. But what it means is we don't seek it over and above God or apart from God. Because when we do, our work can become impure or distracted, focused on things which do not do justice to the dignity of the human person. And we see this in the hands of Joseph holding the lilies, the signs of purity. Thus, the goal of our work should be to discern what the actual work that we are doing is for, how it can serve the common good, and to trust that God's providential guiding of creation will bring our work to a fruitful end. We do not need to be perfect or profound producers to be making real value. Rather, the measure of value itself is not primarily marketability or money or product. It is our active participation in God's creative power by which we are sanctified and by which we are able to bring about the common good. Thank you. Were we okay for questions? Okay, yeah. Are there any questions?
I found it real fascinating that in terms of speaking of, our work, that in the very first chapter of Genesis, where God creates in His own image and likeness, and it's God's power, God's creation, but the word that is used is bara, and only God does that.
Yeah.
And it means both created. It also means saved. So we are called to be creators and saviors, and that is the work that we are called to as human beings.
Yeah, it's a profound calling, and it can be quite scandalous to be say we'll be partaking of this unique work that only God can do, and yet we are called to be partakers of it in a mysterious way. But I think that's the scandal of the Christian message. And I mean scandal in a positive sense here, of course, but it's profound, right? It's just as the cross is a scandal, right? That Christ that God would become man and die is a scandal. And yet it's a scandal because it breaks us out of our preconceptions about who God is. And likewise, breaks us out of our preconceptions that God is up there not minding anything about what's going on in here. No, God cares about every little thing that is happening on earth. If God is indeed who we say He is, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, then He cares about absolutely everything. There's no kind of work or no moment of work which is outside of His care. That's beautiful. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could relate a parable from Ephesians 8:10. Is that something that you're familiar with?
Even though my degree is in theology, I must say I have a terrible recall for verse and chapter, but.
Do you mind if I read it? Real
Yeah,
quick?
go for it. Yeah.
It's something that struck me like about a year ago, and it kind of relates, I feel like, to what you've been saying.
Yeah.
It says, Ephesians 2:8-10 says, "For by grace you've been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them."
Yes. Yeah.
So
is your question, how is that? Does that conflict with what I'm saying, or do you have a different question?
I was wondering if you found any parallels to that, or if you've explored that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that idea is at the center of what I'm saying here, which is that God is always the one who acts first. He acts first in creating us. He acts first in saving us. He acts first. I mean, Thomas Aquinas even goes so far as to say that in everything that we do, me picking up this pen, God is acting directly. Not just indirectly because He created me and gave me the power to lift it, but He's actually actively sustaining my capacity to do so. Which then means that because God is acting, that allows us to also then act as well. So we cannot save ourselves, right? We cannot do any real work apart from God. But because God has redeemed us, our work can not only be efficacious in the real world, right? I can actually change things in the real world. Our work can also have salvific efficacy. So that's why I can say my pastor saved me. I could say my pastor saved me. He gave us a sermon and it helped me come out of a sin that I was stuck in. And what am I saying? Well, my pastor saved me because he learned from Christ how to save me. But he's still a real participant in that act of saving. And similarly, right, I could say I created this presentation for tonight. Now, I had to work with what I was given, right? I didn't create it out of nothing, but I became a real participant in that creation. And so because God is not competitive, he's not a competitive God who thinks that our action would somehow diminish his supremacy. He says, it actually shows my power more if I not only act, but also bring you into my action. And I think that's the great beauty of this way of viewing work, is that we can see, hey, God is acting here too.
Love the definition of work and creation and co-creation with God and saving creation itself. Thinking about, so living for the day of the Lord is the theme of the year in the diocese, and we're supposed to rest from work on Sundays and do leisure. But what you're defining as work now sounds a lot like what I've been told was like leisure. And like I love definitions. So how would Jesus separate the two between like Sunday's work versus Monday through Saturday?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say a couple points I would want to say. First of all, I want to say if we're doing work right, there should be minimal difference, at least on the inside, between work and leisure. Our leisure is not, even though they are different phases of life, right? We have 6 days of work and 1 day of leisure. The internal activity of the soul should be similar in that we are responding to what God has given us. Now that said, right, at the end of the day, there is a difference between maybe I on the side like carpentry and so I want to make a table, right? There's a difference between that and I as a process of livelihood. I make tables because I need that to survive, right? And so I in my talk tonight, I'm not trying to say that wanting to survive or seeking money is the problem, right? There's nothing wrong with saying, I need a job. This is a job I have available to me. It's going to provide money. It's going to put food on the table. But the question is that the last word that I have, right? Or is that's what my work is? My work is for that. Or am I saying, how can this job that I have, how can this further the kingdom? How has God led me to this point where I have this job, the gifts I have? What are we doing in this work? What are we responding to? Perhaps you work for an accounting firm, and so you say, okay, well, what I'm doing is I'm trying to support the businesses or the individuals that I work with. So those are the people that I'm responding to, the gifts that I'm responding to, as well as then my own capacities to do so. Whereas then that might look externally look very different from what I do on Sunday, but internally, I should be directing them all of it to God, ultimately. Does that answer your question? I feel like maybe that didn't answer your question, but I want to.
The internal working of the soul, I think that helps.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. That was an excellent question. I think part of the antidote I think that Catholicism has to this Protestant work ethic idea is precisely the role of leisure, because the point of work is not simply to work in order to kind of save ourselves through our work, but rather to become to find our true vocation in and through what we do. And I think that by emphasizing leisure, we can also understand better what work is for.
Excuse me, not a question, but just kind of going off of that. There's a great book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture by Joseph Pieper.
Yes,
He's
yeah.
Early 1900s philosopher. Catholic, I think he was a Catholic priest, but it might answer that question. I can't see who asked it, but if you might like it, it might help. He talks a lot about.
Yes, excellent book. Yes, for sure. Yeah, it's an excellent book that goes much more in depth than I can possibly go in tonight about the relationship between work and leisure. But I believe in his ultimate vision, there is a lot more similarity between work and leisure than we might tend to think.
And I was just reflecting, put it, on the seventh day, God rested
Yes.
from all the work that he'd done. God did not find a lazy boy in the sky and get back and watch football.
Right.
I honestly believe that God's looking on his creation, and every time we participate, every time we bring God's kingdom more into this world, I think God is rejoicing, and that's how God rests.
Yeah.
And turning the whole shebang over to us was probably one of the nuttiest things that he could have done. But because it was the only way, I think, for us to really come to completion. And that's what I see, in terms of that work, rest, balance. It's an opportunity to really reinvigorate that part of ourselves so we can really appreciate God's work in our lives.
Yeah, God's rest is an active rest, which is why on Sunday we don't simply rest, we also do work. The liturgy, the Mass is work. We're called to active participation in the Mass, which is prayer, and prayer is work, and it's obviously literally work for priests, right? They don't get off on Sunday, and it's because the kind of rest that we're called to is more than simply not working. It's a rest that has its peace in God, who is always active. Are there any other questions? I want to make sure I'm not missing anyone if anyone has a hand. All right, well, thank you all for having me here tonight. It was a pleasure.